My husband cheated with my best friend who volunteered to be our surrogate, and I spent 2 years believing their affair, baby, was mine. Now everyone's calling me, heartless for walking away. I can still remember the day I first felt like everything in my life was falling apart. How the air left my lungs as if someone had punched me in the stomach. It was so vivid, and yet it came after years of subtle signs I had overlooked or explained away. But to truly understand that day, the day my entire sense of family and trust unraveled, I need to start from the beginning. Everything I thought I knew, the strength of my marriage, the loyalty of my friend, my own identity as a mother, was rooted in years of hopes and challenges that brought me to the brink of despair. Maybe if I'd paid closer attention sooner, it wouldn't have blindsided, or maybe it would have anyway, because sometimes people break your heart in ways you can't possibly anticipate. I met my husband almost 10 years ago when I was 26. I had just finished a demanding postgraduate program, secured a decent position at a reputable consulting firm, and felt as though my adult life was finally beginning. He was just a year younger than, only 35 now. So at the time we met, he was 25 and still finishing up some specialized certifications in cybersecurity. We were introduced by mutual friends at a weekend barbecue, and I remember being struck by how genuine he seemed compared to so many men I had dated. He had a relaxed, somewhat shy smile that immediately made me feel comfortable, while at the same time I noticed a little spark of humor behind his eyes. We started talking about the grilled veggie kebabs, moved on to an in-depth discussion of science fiction movies, and found ourselves deep in conversation for most of that afternoon. By the time the sun was going down, I was already thinking about how I wanted to see him again. Our courtship felt both effortless and exciting. We went on dates to museums, movies, sometimes just driving around the city talking about everything from our childhoods to our favorite books. One thing we agreed on from the get-go, we both wanted kids someday. While he was pretty relaxed about the timeline, I remember telling him I couldn't wait forever. I wanted to become a mother. It was a dream that lived inside me so strongly that I would notice my eyes following strollers whenever we walked downtown or in a shopping. He reassured me he was on board, though it wasn't his primary focus at the time. His career in cybersecurity was just taking off, and my job, although stable, was also demanding. Still, we talked about a future that included children, hopefully multiple. We got married after 3 years of dating, in a small ceremony at a local park where he had proposed. It felt like the perfect beginning to the next chapter of our lives together. Family and friends toasted our love. My parents teared up during the vows, and for the first time I felt so certain that I had found a partner who genuinely respected, supported my dreams, and wanted to build a home and family by my side. When I look back on photos from that day, I see two people with eyes full of love, holding hands, believing wholeheartedly that we were each other's forever. For the next few years, we settled into a routine of work, saving money, and traveling when we could. We didn't have extravagant lifestyles, but we made a comfortable living. I earned a bit more because of my position at the consulting firm, which had strong career growth potential, while he was doing well in his cybersecurity role, but at a slightly lower pay scale. We didn't mind at all. He would sometimes joke that one day he'd get a big contract and I could retire early if I wanted. We shared finances fairly equitably. I'd cover the mortgage and a majority of the bills, and he'd handle other household expenses and pay off some of our joint debts. It never once crossed my mind that the financial imbalance would become a stressor. It felt natural and supportive. If one of us made more, then that person would contribute. When we finally decided to start trying for a baby, I was elated, convinced that the next big adventure of our marriage was about to begin. Month after month, I tracked my ovulation, noted every little sign my body gave me, tried all kinds of fertility tricks I found on the internet, changing my diet slightly, exercising regularly but not too intensely, limiting caffeine, even wearing lucky socks for a while because an online forum swore by fertility socks. With each negative pregnancy test, I felt a growing ache in my chest, a worry that maybe something wasn't right. But I tried not to panic. After all, it can take healthy couples up to a year to conceive. Then a year passed, then 2. My sense of dread kept growing, and I convinced my husband we needed to see a fertility specialist. He was supportive, though I'm not sure he felt the same urgency I did. He believed that stress alone could keep us from conceiving, and he worried my anxiety might be part of the problem. Still, he agreed to see the specialist if only to ease my mind. The specialist did what specialists do, ran tests on both of us, made me track everything meticulously, ran more tests, suggested small interventions and medications. More time passed and still no pregnancy. Eventually, during a more thorough evaluation, they discovered uterine fibroids. The doctor explained that these fibroids could interfere with implantation, and that removing them could increase our chances of conceiving and carrying to term. I felt hopeful, in a twisted way, because at least we had found a possible reason. Maybe removing them would solve the problem. The surgery was scheduled, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. I had never had major surgery before, but I also clung to the hope that this would finally pave the way to the motherhood I so desperately wanted. What should have been a routine procedure turned into a nightmare. There were complications, excessive bleeding, and a more extensive spread of fibroids than the doctors initially believed. I remember waking up in the recovery room, hazy from anesthesia, and seeing my husband's face looking ghostly, as if he'd just come from a funeral. The surgeon explained that a partial hysterectomy had been necessary to save my life, that my uterus was removed but my ovaries were intact. My immediate reaction was one of disbelief and a sudden rush of tears that I couldn't control. It felt like my entire body was vibrating with shock. My mother was there too, stroking my hair and trying her best not to sob, whispering that it was going to be okay, that we still had options. I don't even remember what I said. Everything felt surreal, like my life had just been dropped onto a different path entirely without my consent. I spiraled into a depression so deep that I wondered if I would ever resurface. My uterus was gone, so carrying a child myself was impossible. We still had my ovaries, which meant we could retrieve eggs, but what then? My husband tried to be a rock, reassuring me that we'd figure it out, that surrogacy was an option, or adoption. He admitted that he felt helpless, that he didn't know how to console me. My parents kept telling me that blood doesn't make a family, that adoption was a beautiful path, or that surrogacy, though expensive, might allow me to have a genetically related child. I felt too broken to think beyond my grief, but the voices of the people I loved began to break through the fog, enough that I slowly started researching. The more I read, the more I realized surrogacy might be our best chance for a child that was genetically mine and my husband's. It wasn't my first choice. My first choice had always been to carry a pregnancy myself, but life was giving me no such options. As the months passed, I clung to the possibility of surrogacy with a desperation that worried me. I had to become a mother one way or another. We met with several agencies that specialized in matching intended parents with surrogates. The costs were staggering. Between IVF procedures, the surrogate's medical bills, legal fees, and agency fees, it could easily surpass $100,000. We spent hours discussing finances, whether we could take out loans, whether we should consider adoption after all. During this time, my close friend from college, the woman I considered almost a sister, reached out. Brittany was someone I'd known since I was about 19 or 20. We met in a biology class that neither of us particularly excelled at, and we bonded over our shared struggles with dissecting frogs and memorizing cellular structures. Over the years, she and I had stayed close. We supported each other through breakups, family drama, new jobs, and relocations. Brittany had 2 kids of her own already, a son and a daughter, and she was one of the few people I trusted wholeheartedly. When I confided in her about our struggles, about the finances of surrogacy, the repeated heartbreak, she offered something I never expected. She volunteered to be our surrogate. At first, I wasn't even sure if I heard her correct. "I'll carry your baby," she said, her eyes full of empathy and determination. "I've had 2 healthy pregnancies and I want to do this. You deserve to be a mother." I was stunned by her generosity. She repeated that she loved being pregnant, that her husband, they were separated at the time, but still in amicable contact, was okay with it since they'd parted ways and she wasn't looking to expand her own family. She also insisted that it would save us an enormous amount of money because we wouldn't need an agency to match us or pay all those additional fees. Of course, I was skeptical at first. I worried about legal complications, about her changing her mind, about potential emotional entanglements. But Brittany was steadfast. She said we could draft any legal documents we needed, that she would follow any procedure to ensure this was legitimate and safe. It felt like a miracle, a light shining through after my darkest year, so I eventually agreed. My husband, for his part, seemed relieved to see me smile about something again. He was on board, though he was more cautious about the legalities. We had a lawyer help us with the contract, clarifying that the baby, once born, would be ours. Brittany seemed to welcome all the steps without hesitation, reaffirming she had no intention of being the child's mother, only a vessel helping her dear friend. We started IVF treatments with Brittany as the surrogate. The doctors retrieved my eggs, fertilized them with my husband's sperm, and implanted the resulting embryos in Brittany's uterus. The first attempt failed. The disappointment was crushing, but Brittany reassured me that IVF can be tricky, that it might take multiple tries. The second attempt also failed, and I began to worry that maybe there was an issue with my eggs, or with her body's response to the medications. Each negative result felt like a personal betrayal by my own biology. Brittany held me while I cried, insisting she was there for the long haul. On the third attempt, something changed in her hormone levels, and the doctors were optimistic. When we got the news that she was indeed pregnant, I almost fainted from relief and excitement. I remember hugging her so tight, tears streaming down my face while she laughed and cried with me. My husband stood by, grinning, hands shaking. He finally let out a breath he'd been holding for months. Brittany's pregnancy progressed well. She had some morning sickness, some fatigue, but overall it was smooth sailing. I went to as many appointments as I could, though my job was demanding. My husband sometimes accompanied her without me if I was tied up at work, which I found considerate. I didn't want her to go alone. She and I would talk for hours about baby names, nursery decorations, hopes, and dreams. We found out it was a boy at around the 4-month mark. I felt the first spark of that motherly bond the moment I saw the ultrasound picture. We decided we'd name him Ethan, after my grandfather on my mother's side. My husband loved the name too. Everything felt like it was finally falling into place. When Ethan was born, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I was right there in the delivery room, holding Brittany's hand as she pushed, tears streaming down my face because, even though she was doing the physical work, I felt like I was witnessing the miracle of my son's birth. My husband stood on her other side encouraging her, and eventually he stepped around to see the baby emerge, cutting the cord himself. Ethan let out a sharp, healthy cry. The nurse placed him in my arms, and something in me shattered and rebuilt itself in the same moment. I felt a love so intense that I could barely breathe. I looked at Brittany, delirious with gratitude, and she just smiled and nodded as if to say, "He's yours." The first few weeks were a blur. I only took 4 weeks of parental leave because, financially, we couldn't afford for me to be out longer. I was the primary breadwinner, and on top of that, we had accumulated medical and legal costs, even though Brittany had saved us a tremendous amount by waiving traditional surrogacy fees. My husband took some time off as well, but he returned to work pretty quickly. We adapted to our new life, constant feedings, sleepless nights. The joy of seeing Ethan's little face my heart felt complete. I'd whisper to him in those early morning hours, "I'm your mommy. You're finally here." It was a euphoria I thought nothing could destroy. Because of our financial situation, and because babies are expensive, I ended up picking up extra work. I consulted on weekends, sometimes even took late-night gigs analyzing data for small startups. Anything to bring in extra money to ensure we were comfortable. My husband contributed, but his salary wasn't enough to keep up with the mortgage bills and the new baby expenses. So I became the workhorse of the family, pushing myself harder than I ever had before, surviving on minimal sleep. Looking back, I can see how this left me blind to the things that were happening right under my nose. Brittany started coming around the house more often, under the pretense of wanting to see Ethan. Initially, I welcomed her visits. After all, she was Ethan's surrogate mother, and I still loved her like a friend. She and my husband would chat or watch TV while I was busy doing chores or trying to catch up on sleep. Sometimes, I'd come home from a freelance shift on the weekend, and they'd be in the living room with Ethan, laughing at some silly baby antics. My husband claimed it was nice for Ethan to see Brittany now and then, though we all agreed that we needed to keep clear boundaries so there wouldn't be confusion about who his real mother was. It never crossed my mind that they might have anything but an innocent friendship. She had, after all, given us the greatest gift, a child. I was grateful, and I trusted her completely. As Ethan grew, I began noticing something that puzzled. His eyes were brown. My husband's eyes are a pale blue, and mine are a darker shade of blue-green. I knew from basic genetics that 2 blue-eyed parents can sometimes have a brown-eyed child if there are recessive genes in the mix, but it's relatively rare. Whenever the topic came up with friends or family, I shrugged it off, repeating the usual line about multiple genes controlling eye color, how grandparents or even great-grandparents could pass down the allele for brown eyes. In hindsight, this was the first whisper of trouble, the first sign that something didn't add up. But I was too busy, too exhausted, and too in love with my son to dwell on, and he was my son. There was never a moment in which I questioned that. Ethan was just over 2 years old when I scheduled a checkup because he'd had a persistent cold that wouldn't go away. The pediatrician ran a few tests, including a standard metabolic panel and blood. A few days later, they called me to confirm his blood type. They told me he was B+. I paused because I'm a plus and my husband is O+. The nurse asked me again if I was sure about our blood types because biologically, B+ wouldn't be expected from 2 parents with those types. My mind started racing. Could the fertility clinic have implanted the wrong embryo? That was my first thought, that there was some medical mix-up, because of course Ethan was my child. We had gone through multiple IVF attempts. This had to be the clinic's error. I had read horror stories online about couples who received the wrong embryo, and I felt my anger and panic mounting by the second. Immediately, I called my husband and told him about the results. He sounded nervous, but he tried to calm me down. suggesting we talk to a lawyer about possible medical malpractice. I left messages with a few attorneys, explaining the situation, and started the process of scheduling a DNA test to confirm parentage, because if the clinic messed up, we needed indisputable proof for any potential lawsuit. The day the DNA test results came in, my heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. It turned out that Ethan was indeed my husband's biological child, but he wasn't mine. I had no genetic link to him at all. My immediate reaction was a mix of confusion and relief that at least Ethan was my husband's child. But then confusion turned to anger. If not my egg, then whose? We'd been told we were using my eggs for each IVF attempt. Could the clinic have used someone else's eggs? It wasn't making any sense, and I was furious that we might be facing a case of egregious malpractice. When I confronted my husband with the test results, I expected him to be just as shocked, outraged, and ready to sue the clinic. Instead, I watched the color drain from his face. His lips parted, but no words came out. I remember the horrifying moment I realized he looked guilty, not surprised. He sat down, clutching the edge of the kitchen table, avoiding my gaze. My stomach lurched with a nauseating sense of dread. After several agonizing moments of silence, he finally spoke. He and Brittany had slept together a few times during that period when we were trying so hard to get pregnant via IVF. The baby I believed to be mine through IVF surrogacy had actually been conceived the old-fashioned way. He said he never thought she would actually get pregnant from those encounters because he pulled out. He also assumed he might be partly infertile, given our years of failing to conceive before my hysterectomy. They'd felt desperate, frustrated, maybe even a little curious. He said it only happened a few times, that it was never about love, just a moment of weakness. Something about trying to make sure we'd get a baby, an excuse that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. My world collapsed. The betrayal was so intense that I felt physically ill. I locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed until I could barely breathe. I felt betrayed by my husband, the man I trusted with my life, betrayed by my friend, a woman I considered closer than a sister. And then there was Ethan, my sweet boy, who wasn't genetically mine, whose existence was now tainted by this affair in my... Everything I had believed for the last 2 years was a lie. I confronted Brittany, screaming at her on the phone, words flying out of my mouth that I didn't even know I was capable of saying. She burst into tears, apologized repeatedly, said she never wanted to hurt me, that she had been lonely and emotionally vulnerable, that one thing led to another. She insisted she wanted me to still be Ethan's mother, that biologically he might be hers. But I was the one who raised him, who loved him, who paid for everything. She begged me not to break our friendship. I hung up on her, shaking with rage and heartbreak. For days, I couldn't function. I called in sick to work, ignoring phone calls, ignoring even my husband's attempts to speak to me. I stayed at a hotel for almost a week, alone with my thoughts, or sometimes just staring at the television without really seeing it. My mother finally insisted I come stay with them, at least so I wouldn't be alone in my grief. I packed a few things, numb and dazed, and moved into my parents' spare room. I left Ethan with my husband because I couldn't even look at him at that moment. I wish I could say it was only because of my heartbreak over the betrayal. But the truth is, seeing Ethan now reminded me of this monstrous lie I had been living. It devastated me, because at the same time I loved him with all my heart and felt maternal attachment. Yet I felt so betrayed that I had become paralyzed. I didn't know what to do about my marriage, about Ethan, about anything. My parents encouraged me to talk to a divorce lawyer, to figure out what my rights were, both financially and regarding custody. They weren't advocating for me to divorce, necessarily, but they wanted me to be prepared. My father also believed we might have a claim against the fertility clinic if it had contributed to some part of this confusion. However, once we realized there was no mix-up with the clinic, there was no embryo error, no malpractice beyond the moral malpractice of my husband and so-called friend, there wasn't much we could do legally on that front. I couldn't see any path forward that included staying married to a man who cheated on me with my best friend, or a path that allowed me to raise a child that reminded me daily of my friend's body and my husband's betrayal. It felt impossible to swallow. I made up my mind that I was going to file for divorce. I wanted a clean break, to start over somewhere far away from them. I felt like I'd never be able to fully escape the betrayal if I stayed in the same town, surrounded by the same memory. The next question was Ethan. Legally, we had set things up so that I was considered one of his intended parents. That meant I had parental rights and could be on the hook for child support, especially since he was born under the assumption he was the product of our IVF embryo. But now that we knew I wasn't his genetic mother, I wanted to sever my legal ties. I know how cold that sounds, cutting ties with a child I'd called my son for over 2 years. But the pain and anger in me were so strong that I felt I had no other choice. I didn't see how I could possibly co-parent this child with my cheating husband. It would be a constant reminder of the worst betrayal of my life. My husband and Brittany tried to apologize repeatedly, sometimes begging me to come back, other times lashing out that I was acting immature, that I was punishing an innocent child for something that wasn't his fault. But in my view, I was punishing my husband, not my child. Ethan was too little to understand. And the truth is, I knew that if I did stay in his life, I'd never be able to look at him without seeing my friend and my husband together. The heartbreak might destroy me. A part of me felt monstrous for having these thoughts because Ethan, for all intents and purposes, was the child I had raised since birth. But the betrayal overshadowed everything else. When I told my parents I planned to give up my parental rights, they were appalled. They understood why I wanted a divorce, but giving up the child I'd been mother to for 2 years was a different matter. My mother insisted that blood doesn't make a family and that I was hurting myself in the long run by letting him go. She reminded me that a lot of adoptive parents raise children who aren't biologically theirs, and the love can be just as strong. My father, usually more reserved, also pleaded with me to think it through, that this wasn't Ethan's fault, and that I could end up regretting shutting the door on him. But I felt numb, furious, and determined to escape the entire situation. I had no trust left for my husband, no forgiveness left for Brittany, and no desire to put myself through the torture of seeing that living reminder of betrayal day after day. Some of my friends supported my decision, saying they wouldn't be able to handle raising an affair baby either. Others tried to reason with, pointing out that I had loved that boy for 2 years, that I'd called him my son, and how much this would hurt him down the line. I wasn't in a place to hear them. All I could think was that I needed freedom, a fresh start, maybe even a chance to adopt a baby with a partner who would never betray me this way. It felt like the only way to survive. Over the next few weeks, I consulted with attorneys. I filed divorce papers. We're in the process of determining the legal framework for me to relinquish my rights. It's complicated because we initially had legal documents stating that I was the child's intended mother, which is how surrogacy works in our state. But because the genetic reality came out and there was an admission of an affair, there might be grounds to challenge the original surrogacy contract. My lawyers are doing what they can to untangle it. I still remember the last time I saw Ethan before I moved out of the family home completely. He was in the living room, sitting on the carpet surrounded by toy blocks. His chubby little face lit up when he saw me. He toddled over, arms raised, wanting me to pick him up. I did, even though I felt tears burning my eyes. He said, "Mama," a word he had learned to say many months before. My heart splintered. I rocked him for a moment, pressing my cheek to his soft hair, inhaling that sweet toddler scent. In that instant, I almost changed my mind. But then I thought of how my husband had touched Britt, how they had lied to me, how they created this child behind my back. The anger surged again and I pulled away. I set Ethan down, trying not to sob. My husband stood in the doorway, tears in his eyes, silently pleading. I left without another word. Now, I'm staying at my parents' house, at least until the divorce is finalized. I'm also looking at jobs in another state. I've spoken to a therapist a couple of times, and she's helped me see that I'm dealing with immense grief, betrayal, and complicated feelings about motherhood. Part of me still wants to be a mother someday, maybe through adoption, as I told my parents. Part of me wonders if I'll ever trust anyone again. The heartbreak runs so deep that I feel like my life is in ruins. All I can do is pick up the pieces and try to move forward. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, sends me messages every now and then, saying he's sorry, that he never intended to hurt me, that he loves me, that Ethan still needs. Brittany has also reached out, though I haven't responded. I have no desire to speak to either of them. Maybe in a different world, if this had happened in some other way, I could forgive. But this betrayal cuts at the very core of everything I held sacred. They created a child behind my back when I was already at my most vulnerable, having lost my uterus and pinned all my hopes on surrogacy. Even if they regret it now, the damage is done. I've replayed every moment from the past few years, trying to figure out when exactly I lost control of my own life. Maybe it was when I let my desperation to be a mother overshadow my ability to sense something was off. Maybe it was when I trusted too much in people I never should have trusted so completely. But I also know that I can't blame myself for wanting a family, for believing in my husband and my friend. The blame lies squarely with them for betraying me in such a profound way. In my quieter moments, late at night, I sometimes cry for Ethan. I know he's innocent, that he didn't ask to be born into this mess. Part of me will always love him and remember the way he giggled when I played peekaboo, or how his little hands felt curled around my finger. But I also know that seeing him every day would break me. I just don't have the strength to raise the child of my husband's affair with my friend. Maybe that makes me selfish or a terrible person in some people's eyes, but I also think it makes me human. I'm doing what I need to do to survive, to heal, to maybe one day be whole again. My parents have said they'll support me, no matter what I decide in the end, but they still hope I'll reconsider giving up my parental rights entirely. Right now, though, I'm set on it. There's a distance growing between me and my parents too, because I can sense their disappointment. They're torn between compassion for me and heartbreak over my choice to walk away from a child I once claimed as my own. But I can't live my life for them, just like I can't live it for Brittany or my husband. I have to live it for myself, and I can't see any other solution except to walk away from everything that's causing me unrelenting pain. I'm hoping the divorce proceedings will be finalized in the coming months. My lawyers say the parental rights issue might take longer because the courts want to ensure the child's best interests are represented. It's possible I'll be asked to pay child support unless I can prove that the surrogacy contract was invalidated by the fraud committee. It's a legal quagmire, and I can't escape the sense of betrayal that they're now throwing me into a system where I might be forced to pay for a child that isn't genetically mine and was conceived through an affair. On the other hand, a part of me wonders if child support is the lesser evil, if it means I can still walk away without a daily reminder that my entire world was destroyed. It's a practical but emotionally fraught decision. As for Brittany, I've heard from mutual friends that she's distraught, that she regrets everything, that she never wanted it to go this far. Some say she hoped we could somehow co-parent Ethan in a modern arrangement, though she acknowledges it's her child biologically. The very idea of that makes my stomach turn. I've been clear with anyone who asks. I don't want to see her or speak to her again, and I'll block her on every platform if she persists. I feel she robbed me of my dream in the cruelest way possible, and there's no coming back from that in my heart. I've also started thinking about the future, about possibly adopting a child one day, but only after I've healed enough and am in a place where I can trust someone again. I don't want to carry this bitterness and pain into another relationship or into motherhood if I do choose to adopt as a single parent. I've started therapy to work through my anger, my grief, and the gnawing sense of inadequacy I've felt since losing my ability to carry a child. My therapist assures me that healing will take time, but that it's possible that I can find peace on my own terms. I'm clinging to that hope because I need to believe that my life isn't defined by this betrayal, that maybe there's a second chance out there for me. It's still surreal. Some days I wake up and forget for a moment, thinking Ethan's just in the other room waiting for his morning bottle or his favorite cereal, only to remember that I'm at my parents' house, that I've left him behind, that everything changed. My friends are split. Some say I'm doing the right thing for my mental health. Others say I'll regret leaving a child I once called my son. But none of them have walked in my shoes, felt this level of betrayal, or discovered that a child they believed was theirs was actually the result of an affair with their own friend. This is my reality, however ugly it may be. At the end of this long and heartbreaking journey, I've decided to trust my instinct to leave. I refuse to stay tied to a cheater and what I see as the living reminder of his betrayal. My plan is to relocate several states away once the legal situation is resolved. I want to find a new job, a new place to live, maybe near the ocean or in the mountains, somewhere I can breathe fresh air and start over. I'm not deluding myself into thinking I can just erase the past, but I can at least set boundaries that protect me from further harm. If I ever do hold another baby in my arms, I want it to be in a context of trust and love, not lies and deceit. In the quiet moments, I find myself repeating one mantra. I did everything I could with the information I had at the time. I tried every path to motherhood, exhausted every resource, poured my heart and soul into the child I believed was mine. It isn't my fault they lied to me, that they shattered the sanctity of what surrogacy should have been. If this makes me cruel or heartless in some people's eyes, so be it. I'm done sacrificing my well-being for people who didn't hesitate to betray me in the most painful way. That's where my story stands now. I'm filing for divorce, giving up my parental rights, and looking to move far away to start a new life. I'm clinging to the hope that someday I'll have the family I've always wanted, whether through adoption or another process, when I find a partner who truly deserves my trust. Perhaps this is the kind of heartbreak that reshapes you into someone stronger, more guarded, but eventually wiser. I'm not there yet. Right now, it just feels like I'm walking through the ashes of the life I once knew, but I'm determined to keep walking until I find a place where I can heal. If the people who betrayed me think I'm heartless, that's on them. If my parents disagree, I can't help that. This is my life, and for my own survival, I need to cut all ties with the past, even if it means saying goodbye to a child I once thought was mine. I don't expect others to understand. I know some people will condemn me as soon as they hear I'm giving up parental rights, but they haven't lived this nightmare. They haven't poured their life savings into a surrogacy arrangement, only to learn it was unnecessary because the surrogate and the husband bypassed the procedure in the worst way possible. Maybe one day I'll make peace with Ethan's existence. Maybe even find a way to speak to him if he wants answers about his birth when he's old. But right now, I can't. The wound is too raw, too deep. One day, I hope to be far from this tragedy, living a peaceful existence, maybe volunteering, maybe finding a community that supports me unconditionally. Perhaps I'll meet someone honest and kind, someone who understands the scars I carry. And maybe, If the stars align, I'll become a mother in a way that honors love and truth, rather than infidelity and deceit. Until then, all I can do is try to survive each day and remember that even though this betrayal has destroyed the life I thought I had, it hasn't destroyed me completely. I'm still here, breathing, fighting, and that has to count for something.